Chapter 8. He walked to town. He was not hungry, but he was hot. A sign above a bank said the temperature was 98 degrees. The sun was almost directly overhead. Shadows were short. He turned abruptly and pushed through a glass door. Coolness washed over him. The Eldorado's air conditioning had died 20 towns ago. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Was the voice speaking to him? He realized he was standing with his eyes closed. When he opened them, he saw a woman behind a counter. There were books on shelves behind her. To her left were more books. Through an archway, he could see round tables where people sat, some reading newspapers, and a row of book-filled cases, like a battalion at attention. He was in a library. "Hit 100 yet?" said the lady, smiling. She was old, judging by her almost white hair, though her voice, when his eyes were closed, had seemed much younger. Strangely, he had no sense of whether she was a mother or not. 98, he replied. The lady kept smiling at him. He stood just inside the door. "Stay a while?" she said. He shrugged. "Have a card?" "Huh?" "Library card. Do you have one?" "No." "Want one?" "No." He felt time drop him and fly on with only his voice receding. "No." When time picked up again, he was at the counter. "You're sure?" the smiling lady was saying. She was holding out her hand. He gave her the white plastic bag he had taken from the boy. He hadn't realized he still had it. "Are you sure?" she repeated slowly, her voice twinkling as she turned the bag upside down. Out fell a box of crayons, a Spider-Man ring, 2 speckled jawbreakers, and a pack of baseball trading cards. She pulled the wrapping from the cards. "Are you—" She turned the cards over one at a time. Baseball faces, baseball caps, until one was left, the bottom card. "Sure?" It was unlike the others. No face, no cap, just plain blue. She held it before his eyes and she smiled. "This is it." She reached across the counter and slipped the blue card into his pocket. She nodded toward the reading room. "Make yourself at home." He thought of leaving, but instead followed her directions. He walked through the archway. For an instant, crazily, he thought he smelled bacon. Ooh. He meandered among the round tables and the tall bookcases. He did not touch the books. He admired the glassless ceiling. He heard a faint noise, a faint voice. He kept looking to see who was speaking, but the people at the tables had their heads down. He knew 2 things about libraries. They had books, and you weren't allowed to speak in them. Well, 3 things. In summer, they were air-conditioned. The voice seemed less distant near a second archway, at the far end of the great room. A sign said, "Children." He followed an arrow down a stairway. The voice was coming from behind a closed door. A hand-lettered sign propped on an easel said, "Today, preschool, Miss Storytime, 1 p.m. Chapter 9. When Edwina saw the boy open the door, she assumed he had made a mistake and would be gone. Instead, he came right in. Family emergency, she thought. He's coming for one of the mothers. But no, he simply took a seat. He had to be at least in his teens. Sullen face, could use a bath too, and a haircut. By now, of course, she was reading to a dozen backs of heads, the preschoolers having turned to stare at the creature slouching in the back row. Was that his intention, to disrupt story time? Or was it just general teenage boy mayhem? As the mothers swiveled their children's heads back to the front, Edwina turned the page and read on. Though she was an unpaid library volunteer, she took pride in her professionalism. Once she donned her blue and gold silk robe and became Miss Storytime. Nothing, no crying child, no late arrival, no unwelcome visitor could turn her from her task of reading to the children every Wednesday at 1. A squeaky voice yelped from the audience, "Miss Storytime!" Once, in an identical moment, Edwina had put down her book, looked at the child and said, "Yes?" But there had been no answer. In the following years, it happened many times. "Miss Storytime! Miss Storytime!" And Edwina had come to understand that these were simply the spontaneous outbursts of children who could not contain the thrill of finding themselves in the same room with her. Now, when it happened, Edwina raised one eyebrow in responding salute and read on. Was he here to mock her? That was always a possibility with teenagers. She finished Babar and began Madeline. The boy was sprawling, stringy-haired head lolling drunkenly to one side, eyes closed, heels propped up on the seat back before him, arms flopping over the flanking chairs. In short, the typical arrogant, I-do-as-I-please teenage boy slouch. Maybe he was running from the police. Who would think to look for a delinquent in a preschool story hour? Was he sleeping? She read the final lines, and to her surprise, she found that suddenly there was enough hound to go all around. She showed the last page and dramatically closed the book and bowed. Applause showered her warmly. As usual, a tiny voice or two yelped, "Don't stop, Miss Storytime!" But the mothers were already moving, chairs were sliding, and in a minute they were gone. The boy remained. What was she to do? Alone now with a slouching teenager twice her size. A murderer for all she knew. She wanted to run. She wanted to stuff her storytelling robe into her tote bag and get out of there. But her hands were not moving, and neither was the boy. And the fourth book continued to lie insistently on the table. Every week the librarian left 3 books on the table, 3 books to be read. This week Edwina had found 4. But the 4th book was clearly a mistake. It was not a picture book, but an adult paperback, a dingy cotton-eared romance titled, now that she glanced at it, Love, Call Me by My First Name. There was a carousel rack of them upstairs in the corner, and that's where this one certainly belonged, with its typical cover of long-haired voluptuine and her swarthy adorer. The sloucher, whose crusty, propped-up sneaker soles obscured his face, was not sleeping. Somehow she knew this, as she knew that the paperback on the table was in fact not a mistake. From some dim distance she heard the little ones, at least they looked up to her, belt out the chant that began every hour. Miss Storytime, read us a story. Her trembling fingertips idled along the gold threadwork of her silk robe, and at last reached for the book. She began to read aloud. Odd, right? She was reading this book aloud. Chapter 10. She did not believe it. The clock on the wall said 10 minutes to 5, but it was true. Her own watch said the same. She'd been reading for almost 3 hours. In all that time he had moved only once. She had seen it between his sneaker soles, one eye suddenly wide open, then shut again. And now, as he unslouched himself and made his way toward her, she wanted nothing more than to plead, "Please stay, I want to go on." To show him, she kept reading. Watched from the doorway as SONSERAY rode off, then ran to the dormer window on the 3rd floor to keep him in view as long as possible, for every time he left, he finished the last sentence, feared she would never see him again. He reached out. His mouth had a shape she could not identify. Tears were in his eyes. She handed him the book. So, stop for a moment and think about all this new information. He goes into a library. Of course, we know magical things are happening in the library these days. And wanders down to story time, and this book magically appears. And the name of the character is SONSERAY. Wow. Chapter 11. So, it was real after all. Even the cover he remembered. Not that he had ever forgotten, but in recent years it had begun to seem too much like a remembered dream. Story and mother, both. In how many libraries, 100, 1,000, had he scanned the shelves for the cover, the title? How many bookstores, drugstores, wherever they stopped, and sometimes where they didn't, making Jack screech to a halt, bolting from the car to check out a Rite Aid or Thriftway. Until lately, he had despaired of ever finding the book, and of finding in it some measure of the mother who had read it so many times to him when he was little, and did not know that she was not forever. He had begun to think he had dreamed himself up. He tossed the blue card onto the counter. The librarian said nothing. He knew. She knew. The book would not return. Walking, he opened the book and picked up where the lady in the robe had left off. It was all coming back to him. The story of Rebecca, who lived on the seacoast high in the pines, and the mysterious man on a horse. The book was half over before Rebecca said to him, "Have you a name, sir?" And his mother would stop reading and look at him with that grin on her face, all waiting for the answer. And he would say, making his voice low and grown up, "I have, madam." And his mother would read, as she had 100 times before, "And what might that be, sir?" And she would wait again, and he would blurt out, "SONSERAY!" Sansaray, him, himself, his mother, Noreen Molarski. While other 4-year-olds nightly begged for tales of red dogs and green eggs, of big bad wolves and little engines that could, Sansaray craved, "Love, call me by my first name." It was the only story his mother ever read to him, and all he wanted. He never had to beg. It both tickled and frustrated him that no matter how many times his mother read the story, Rebecca and Sansaray did not seem to know that the ending would be happy. They wanted to be together desperately. His mother would gasp out the word, "Desperately." But the world conspired to keep them apart. Complications, enemies, misunderstandings, bad luck. Such a tangle ball. Would it ever unravel? It did. Every time in the last chapter. Sansaray and Rebecca rushed into each other's arms, galloping off in the foaming surf. And always on the last page, the sweet tip of the story, himself allowed to bite it off while his mother swooned and fluttered her fingertips over her heart. He stopped walking. He leaned against a street sign pole. There was traffic, but few buildings. Across the street, a hand-painted sign on a white plaster said, "Ray's Auto Repair." There were no curbs. His shadow leaned halfway across the roadway. Ray, back pocket disgorging a rag, was working late. He closed his eyes and pressed the book between his hands and chest. In time, he felt the thumping, but was unsure of the heart's location. Out of Ray's came the explosive chatter of an air-powered nut wrench. He smiled, seeing the dreamy drumming of his mother's fingernails on her breast. To the passing cars, to the long shadows, and Ray the wrencher, and to his mother, who gave him the gift he could never lose or run away from, to her dreamy, quirky, sad, and silly face, he recited aloud the final words of his favorite and only bedtime, daytime, lifetime story. And just before dawn, as Sansaray held tight to her hand, Rebecca gave birth to a baby boy. And that's the end of the story of Sansaray. Now, as we've experienced in the other stories, the library card was magical. It offered each character that opportunity to turn their lives around. So now what we're left to do is to wonder how Sansaray is going to use this opportunity. Alrighty, so now you've got some questions to answer, and we have one more story left. Bye for now.